Absolute horror show that the Conservatives have inflicted on working people in this country, on our public services, on anybody paying a mortgage. Every one of them has been punished by the incompetence of the Conservative government.
That is more money for Scotland's NHS, schools and other vital public services. The fact is that this is an incompetent SNP government that is bad with taxpayers' money. So more of the same won't cut it.
I tell you what, John Swinney's got some front. The man whose dirty fingerprints are all over the tram scandal, the ferry scandal, the Salmond inquiry scandal, the named persons scandal. How much has this man's mistakes cost all of us?
The Steamy Politics Podcast from The Scotsman.
Hello and welcome to The Steamy, the politics podcast from The Scotsman. I'm Rachel Amery, the political correspondent at the paper, and today I am joined by Deputy Political Editor David Ball and our Westminster correspondent Andrew Quinn to analyse the week that's been. And my goodness, what a week it has been. Let's start off with the big news story. I say the big news story, I feel like there have been so many big ones, but the obvious big story. Peter Mandelson, the scandal there. Now, this seems to be changing by the day, but at this point, when we're recording, it's Thursday afternoon. At this point, we've had the Prime Minister admitting that he knew about Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein when he was appointed as US ambassador. We've had a police investigation open up as well. We've had Mandelson be accused of handing over highly sensitive government documents as well. And there's growing pressure on Keir Starmer and his Chief of Staff and questions about whether they are going to still be in their jobs for much longer. Andrew, you're in Westminster. This is very much a Westminster story, although there are ramifications being felt in Holyrood. It's quite the week. Can you just try to explain what it is all happening in Westminster right now? Because it's quite something else.
Yeah, so obviously we got the US Department of Justice released all these files relating to Epstein. There's loads and loads and loads of them. But among some of them were emails from Peter Mandelson. So Peter Mandelson, obviously a long-time New Labour figure. He'd been involved in the comms team in the 80s and the 90s for a bit, and then became an MP. He was MP for Hartlepool and was very allied to Tony Blair. And when New Labour came in, he became part of the government. But he was sacked twice in disgrace from the cabinet during the New Labour years. The second time was in 2001. I've seen a lot of clips and it was people saying, there's no way Peter Mandelson will ever be in frontline politics again. They were saying then. And he actually left as an MP and then ended up coming back to government because Gordon Brown was struggling and brought him into the Lords. And really, so that was in 2008, and he was business secretary between 2008 and 2010. And that's the main period that this whole debacle's about, because while he was business secretary and we're going through the global financial crash at that time, emails showed that he was passing market-sensitive information to Jeffrey Epstein. So he was talking about different bailouts. He even said that the government was done for at one point. So he's passing on all this information to Jeffrey Epstein, who's a financier as well. So it's market-sensitive it's stuff he shouldn't be passing on. So that's annoyed an awful lot of folk. But really where it concerns today's government is that he was the ambassador to the US and it was a political appointment. He's obviously not a career ambassador. But Keir Starmer decided he should become ambassador to the US after Labour won the general election in 2024. The big issue is that the government knew that he'd been pals with Epstein, and they knew that Epstein's a really controversial figure, the world's most notorious paedophile. But they basically judged that it was worth the risk because they thought he'd be a great Trump whisperer. He's a big ally of Morgan McSweeney, who we'll talk about later on, who's the Downing Street Chief of Staff. He's been involved in Labour for a long time. So they basically took that risk. But so much controversy has come up. He gets sacked last year because he admitted that he had kind of been pushing against Epstein's conviction. And then obviously we've now got this whole bother going on. Now, the Prime Minister is kind of trying to portray himself as a bit of a victim here. It's quite funny, really, to watch. He's saying, "Oh, Mandelson lied to us. He betrayed the country." They're going on all this kind of moral outrage, which I'm sure they're annoyed about that. But he's saying, yeah, he lied to us about the extent of his relationship with Epstein, even though it was in the public domain that he'd stayed pals with him after he was convicted. So that's been the whole thing that's been going on. I mean, I think Labour MPs are tearing their hair out. Those that have hair, of course. But yeah, they're really they just can't believe it's another scandal that it's kind of they didn't need. It's an unforced error. Like, I wrote this in a column yesterday. Everyone in their gran knew that Mandelson was controversial and that his relationship with Epstein would cause problems for the government. Look, Epstein's a hugely controversial figure. There's no other dead criminal who's in the news as much as Jeffrey Epstein. There's revelations all the time about him. Like, the US are looking into everything that he did. So the chances that some of his correspondence with Mandelson, who was a great pal of his, would be released was always pretty high. So it seemed crazy to make this man the US ambassador when they had other options there. So yeah, it's caused whole sorts of problems. Now we've been worried, or no, we've been worried, sorry, but people have been worried that the Prime Minister might go. Some worried, some wanting him to go. And it looked yesterday like it was probably the end for him. It really, really looked bad. I think his own MPs were absolutely livid. But perhaps after a night of sleep, they've actually realised there's no one immediate that they can replace him with. So that's the only saving grace for the Prime Minister, is that there's no one else lined up to take over at the moment.
Yeah, you're mentioning who comes next. There's actually a piece on our website right now. I think it's David Hepburn that's written it, looking at what the odds are and who people are looking at to come next. And there's not a standout person there. There's not an obvious person to sort of take over. So that is potentially one of the big problems for the party down in Westminster just now. Andrew, you were mentioning Morgan McSweeney there. So he might not be someone that everyone's quite so familiar with as they are with Keir Starmer. Can you explain who Morgan McSweeney is and why we're talking about him here? Because it looks like he might be the one that might have to go rather than Keir Starmer, for example.
Yeah, so that's kind of been what's said, that someone has to go, heads have to roll. So it could be Morgan McSweeney, who's the Downing Street Chief of Staff. Now, he's known for basically being the power behind the throne, the man behind Starmer, who's doing everything. He's been part of his team for a long time, since Starmer started as leader. He's been basically the most senior advisor for that whole period. His wife is also an MP, a Scottish MP, Imogen Walker. She's at Hamilton and Clyde Valley. So he's a hugely, hugely influential figure. He's basically the most influential non-elected person in British politics. So he calls a lot of the shots, apparently. He's a huge advisor, advises on most of the decisions. And the reason they're under pressure here is he's meant to be Lord Mandelson's protege, and he was pivotal in him getting appointed as US ambassador. So people are saying that it shows his judgment is flawed. But the issue is that he's so ingrained in the Starmer project. I would imagine a lot of people would argue that Labour wouldn't have won the election without him. That's kind of, he's credited with that, with helping Labour to the landslide election that they had in 2024. And could the Prime Minister even go on if he got rid of him? I think it pretty unlikely, given that a large part of the reason why Keir Starmer is Prime Minister is because of Morgan McSweeney.
Oh my goodness. Well, this is very much a story that's happening and kicking off in Westminster, but we are still getting the ramifications of it here in Holyrood. John Swinney's been asked about it. He's launched an inquiry from his permanent secretary into what was known, particularly when it comes to the financial crash and things like that. back when he was an MP. There's also been questions as well, because if you remember last year, John Swinney went to the US to speak to Donald Trump about whiskey tariffs, and while he was there, he stayed overnight in the ambassador's residence in the US. Now, he was questioned for that, his staff have been questioned on that, and they very much said, well, look, if he'd spent taxpayers' money in a hotel, you would have complained about that. So I can understand that argument, but he's definitely questions being raised there. One person that's also being asked questions is Anna Sarwar, Scottish Labour leader, previously referred to Peter Mandelson as an old friend, and has very much changed his tune today. So let's just quick listen to what Anna Sarwar told journalists today.
Should the Prime Minister resign, or do you still have confidence in him?
Look, I'm utterly disgusted and furious by the entire situation. Peter Mandelson should never even been considered to be the ambassador to the US. He never should have been the ambassador to the US. It's right he's not a member of the Labour Party and he should be stripped of all his titles. And it's right he is now investigated by the police. We need full transparency on the process of that decision. I know that's what the Parliament voted for yesterday at Westminster, because people across the country are rightfully angry and they're furious about this.
So the Prime Minister got it wrong?
Well, clearly it was a mistake to appoint him as the ambassador, clearly a mistake to even consider him to be capable of being the ambassador to the US. It's right he's not in the Labour Party and he should be stripped of his...
So your question...
Quite a change in stance from Anna Sarwar. Clearly he's very, very angry and wanting to distance himself as much as he possibly can from Mandelson at this point. David, what did you make of the comments there? Because he was also a wee bit critical of the Prime Minister there.
Yeah, and I mean, this is how Anna Sarwar's got himself into a lot of trouble in the polls, is that he's kind of wedded himself to Keir Starmer personally, and Peter Mandelson, as you said, called him a friend. So yeah, it was basically questioning Keir Starmer's judgment here, saying that he should never have been appointed in the first place. That is a direct attack on Keir Starmer for this, and he is just trying to distance himself as much as possible. I mean, from the SNP's point of view, this is another absolute open goal for them. It's just what they needed, takes all the pressure off them for anything else. I mean, Rachel, what do you think? Do you think he was just kind of focusing on the politics of this, Anna Sarwar, by his U-turn? Is he just trying to save his skin a bit when he's facing quite a big defeat in May?
Yeah, I mean, the polling's not great for Scottish Labour right now. They're potentially down in third place behind the SNP in Reform, not where Anna Sarwar wants to be. So I can imagine he clearly knows that the Westminster government's holding him back, because we've seen him in the past few weeks trying to put some distance between him and Keir Starmer, which is a completely different picture from how it was before, where they were very keen to be seen photographed together, talking about each other like they were good friends. Even discussions about like Anna Sarwar's sons, for example, being sort of friends and talking to the Prime Minister. So clearly trying to distance himself there. Is that part of what's happening here again? It's like, oh God, I've got to say something that makes it clear that I've now distanced myself from it. But as you were saying, if you're the SNP, it's a very easy win over Scottish Labour here for you in the polls. So it's going to be interesting to see how much that plays into the actual way people are going to vote in May. It could very well cause a bit of upset, because it's clearly a big scandal at the moment. So let's just put both of you on the spot here. So Andrew, you first. This time next week, will Keir Starmer still be Prime Minister?
I'm going to say yeah, definitely. And I'd even go and say he'll last after the May elections, which sounds crazy, but as I said, there's no one immediately to replace him. And someone had said this to me, I thought it was quite a good line. HMRC is basically keeping him in a job because Angela Rayner's tax case hasn't been solved yet. So maybe once Angela Rayner's tax case is done, he'll go. But he'll definitely be in a job next week.
What about Morgan McSweeney?
Yeah, him as well. Honestly, I now don't see them going because the PM can't afford to sack Morgan. He's so reliant on him. And yeah, there's no real replacement.
How about you, David? Are you same boat? Are you saying the same thing there?
Yeah, I think so, but I don't know what cost that is to Labour, to be honest. If he hangs on the next couple of years, because this is not going away. It is a proper scandal, the Mandelson stuff, and it will just cause more damage. At least they could, if he went, they could potentially just pin it all and all the other stuff on the PM. and say there's new people in town, basically, and we're different now. That's just, that legacy will just drag on until the next UK general election. So, yeah, I do expect them to hang on. I'm not so sure about after the May elections, because they are looking pretty frightening for Labour across the UK. So whether that will be, I think there'll be an attempt to get rid of him after that, but whether, as Andrew says, they can't find a proper replacement or someone who's going to do any better than him, that's going to be the key issue here. And I think he probably will just kind of keep going, as painful as it will be to watch.
I think there is a bit of an argument for keeping a Prime Minister for longer than 2 years. You know, we've had so many changes. We've had loads of changes since David Cameron was left in 2016, pretty frequent changes. And I think that's something that's probably playing among Labour MPs' minds as well. So they'd think about getting rid of him, but they're like, actually, we need a bit more stability, and perhaps that will serve us when it comes to 2029. I mean, we've not had such a calamitous start for a government, though, potentially ever. So we're kind of in uncharted territory, I think. So it means you can't apply all the same rules.
Let's move on to the other big story that's happening. Now, we've spoken before on the podcast about this, but it's definitely a story that's not going away. The Queen Elizabeth University Hospital scandal. We are recording this on Thursday. David, you had a front page story today about the former chief nurse suggesting that families affected be paid off the trip to Disneyland, because I'm sure that would have made it all better, of course. This is an absolute cracker of a story. So if you're listening to this and you haven't read this story yet, please go onto our website, have a look at the politics tab. It's quite the story that you all need to have a read of it. It's really good. So, David, can you just bring us up to what's happened today? Because there's, again, another long-running story. There's got a lot of things going on here. Where are we right now?
Yeah, so this story is pretty wild. There's been quite a few things with Queen Elizabeth this week. We learned the other day that the hospital isn't actually validated for its ventilation system. The Scottish Government basically saying, well, we just have to wait for the inquiry to rule on what's happening, which seems absolutely ridiculous given that we're talking about the current state of the hospital. But today's story is, as you said, Fiona McQueen, who actually a lot of people might remember from standing alongside Nicola Sturgeon during a lot of her COVID briefings as the chief nursing officer, basically made these comments to one of the prominent whistleblowers, Christine Peters, who still works at the hospital, saying that she didn't understand why the health board, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which has been under incredible pressure over this, didn't just pay off the families with 50 grand, which would be a trip to Disneyland, rather than kind of admit liability. It's absolutely quite a ridiculous thing to say. It's so insensitive, obviously, given what the families have gone through. Anna Sauer brought it up at FMQs this afternoon, very angry, actually, literally shouting in the chamber that it was shameful. John Smith didn't have a response to it, didn't really address it. I asked his spokesperson after FMQs whether he stood by Fiona McQueen, because she's... although she's not in nursing anymore, she retired after the pandemic. She's chair of the Scottish Police Authority, and his spokesman said he does have complete confidence in her, but it's not the language that John Swinney will have used. But, I mean, this inquiry is ongoing. It has been for years, but it's not going away from the SNP. I don't think the Scottish Government is handling the quite legitimate questions that people are raising very well by just saying there's an inquiry going on, because sometimes, like the other aspect that's come out this week, is that they were told about these infections way before March 2018, that it was to do with the fabric of the building. In March 2017, we reported on Monday, and they're quite happy to talk about the details of that aspect of it that's in the inquiry evidence, but anything a bit uncomfortable, they kind of back away from. So I think it's going to rumble on. I think there's a lot of anger over these comments that we've kind of reported today. Again, though, we don't know whether it's going to have any impact on the election that's coming up in a few months. A few people in the SNP with some quite silly sort of responses to some of this, saying, well, there was Labour people on the board of the health board, and it's getting they're not covering themselves in glory by going for that when all these families were suffering quite badly. I mean, if you read some of the harrowing evidence, I've spent more time than I'd like to admit reading through some of it this week, and it is pretty disgraceful, some of the treatment that the families suffered. So I'm interested to see what happens next, with the Scottish Government will kind of open up to talking about it a little bit more, but as it stands, it looks like they're just going to kind of hide back behind that inquiry, which could take months, years even, to report.
Yeah, you're mentioning there about when these alerts came through. So after First Minister's questions, all the journalists get to sit down with some of the government officials, ask whatever questions that we want, and it was very much dominated by this, like how many people knew about these alerts, why didn't other people know about the alerts, who's telling the truth. I mean, even the journalists were getting a wee bit kind of angry, saying, we need these answers too. These families are relying on these answers and we're not getting anything. So unfortunately, that briefing with the government spokespeople didn't provide any more light on the situation, unfortunately. Now, you were talking there about the election, because this is quite interesting, because we're saying how the SNP, Johnson has brought in to steady the ship. It kind of seems like he has. Polling's a bit consistent now for them. They look like they're going to remain the largest party, but there's been so many scandals for the SNP in recent years, and they've somehow managed to come out the other end of all these scandals into a position where they're not doing too badly. They kind of a lot of the election result will rely on other parties losing as opposed to them winning. But Andrew, what do you think there? Do you think this is a scandal that once again the SNP will somehow manage to not get over, but just kind of get past enough to do okay in the election? Or do you think this is going to be something that's going to be a big problem for them?
I think it could have a small dent on them, maybe a very, very minimal sort of impact, but I don't think it's going to have a major impact. I know the NHS is the biggest issue for Scottish voters regularly in polling, but I think the main issue if we're saying can someone beat them, it would only be Scottish Labour, really, probably, and they need to improve their own image if they're going to do that. So it could result in less SNP voters getting out. That's probably would be the only positive for any other party with this. But I don't see it having a huge impact. I'm sure we'll see though when it comes to the election, Labour and Reform and all the other opposition parties will have a huge list of all of these scandals which have gone on, and we'll see different images of that. Perhaps that will resonate in voters' minds, but at the moment we've pretty much just got a referendum on the UK government rather than on the Scottish government.
David, I can see you nodding along there. Is this a kind of a view into what the election campaign is going to be? Is it just going to be a case of each party hurling different scandals at each other, and just whoever has the least amount sticking to them at the end is the one who wins? Is it going to be as dire as that?
Oh, I think the election campaign is going to be horrendous. I'm not blaming anyone in particular. I just think it will. The way that it's set up, Labour, the Tories are absolutely desperate for anything to stick. Reform as well. I mean, we saw in the by-election last year that they wouldn't rule anything out. No tactic are off the table. So I think it's going to be pretty dire stuff, to be perfectly honest. I think this could have a little impact in Glasgow and some of those marginal seats. We've mentioned that before, but I think Andrew's right. I don't think it's really going to cost the SNP the election. We've had for years talk from opposition parties. Well, the SNP, people are sick of the NHS, they're sick of the SNP, and they just keep winning elections regardless of any of this. So there's no evidence to suggest that this is going to be any different. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of desperate stuff from Anna Sarwar and Labour, and this is a legitimate thing they're bringing up. This is not, I'm not trying to say that they're being desperate by bringing up the hospital scandal, but we'll see a whole lot of other stuff thrown at the SNP for this sort of list of scandals. And I think the hospital one is a genuine scandal. Governments waste money all the time, regardless of whether they want to or not on stuff, and it's just part of government. If Labour are in, there will be other things that would happen. So maybe look at Westminster. But whether that cuts through the public, it hasn't in the last 2 decades, so we'll just have to wait and see. But all signs point to the SNP being the biggest party.
Yeah, I think Glasgow's going to be very interesting when it comes to the election. Now, please correct me if I've got this wrong, but I'm pretty sure all the constituency MSPs in Glasgow are SNP, I think, and then all of the MPs from the 2024 election then switched to Labour in the city. So the fact that the entire city switched is quite something. So Glasgow is going to be a really interesting place to watch in this election. and it's going to be interesting to see if this scandal at the hospital does put a dent into that. Very, very interesting there. Now, that is all we have time for this week. Plenty more stories to come on both of these things, both of the topics we're discussing today. So keep an eye on Scotsman's website throughout the week, because I'm certain there'll be more developments on both the Mandelson story and the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital scandal too. So thank you to Andrew and to David and to our producer Kelly, and we will see you all next week.